Hey, this is Language Shrimp, and today we're discussing some basic syntax, i.e. mainly just the syntax of indicative or declarative statements. First, we'll talk a bit about the various roles words can have and how that usually translates to syntax. Then we'll talk about how these roles are strung together in various languages based on a pattern called head directionality. And finally, discuss some more niche clause and sentence types. So, there are three main ways of categorizing words and phrases in a sentence. Semantic Role, which describes the literal meaning of parts of a sentence in relation to each other. Pragmatic Role, which describes different parts of a sentence in relation to information structure or relevance. And Syntactic Role, which describes the arbitrary ways languages attempt to represent the previous two roles. Now, Semantic Role, also sometimes called Thematic Role or Thematic Relation, is based on semantics or meaning. Technically, Semantic Role only really is supposed to apply to noun phrases, i.e. phrases that carry the meaning of a noun but may have attached adjectives, determiners, adpositions, etc., or may be headed or be something that's technically another word or class performing the meaning, like a non-finite verb or pronoun, or adverbial phrases, which have the same meaning but for adverbs that describe a phrase instead of a noun. The most important semantic roles are agent and patient, the noun phrase that performs an action and the one that undergoes it. Although there are many more that are often marked by an adposition or adverb, or grammaticalized with case. The agent and patient semantic roles are very often confused with the subject and object, syntactic roles, and this is because they do usually map onto them pretty well, which I'll get into with syntactic role. But these concepts are, or at least should be, very different. I still see reputable sources using agent and subject kind of interchangeably, which can cause a whole lot of messiness. Next, pragmatic role, which can be a bit more abstract and hard to grasp. It has two major roles, the topic or theme and comment or ream, plus the pseudo-role of focus, which is the most important or relevant part of the comment. The topic is what the sentence is understood to be about. Meanwhile, comments are things said about the topic. Some experts like to think of everything other than the topic in a sentence as one comment, but others might split the different phrases into different comments. Take the phrase, she pet the dog. Here, the sentence is about she, and pet the dog is a comment on what she did, compared to the dog was pet by her. Here, the dog is what you are talking about, and was pet by her is a comment on what happened to the dog. Theoretically, any type of phrase, or even subcomponents of phrases like individual adjectives, could fill the role of topic in a sentence, but usually the topic will be a noun phrase. Finally, what this video is mainly about, syntactic role, which, as mentioned, is the arbitrary ways languages attempt to combine the two above roles. Different languages do this in different ways, but this video is mainly going to talk about strict word order languages with accusative alignment. This is because I plan on making a video on free word order languages, but you generally want to know word order at its strictest before you start trying to free it up, and because I plan on making a video on morphosyntactic alignment. And for most alignments, you can describe them as having different permutations of accusative alignment, and because nominative accusative alignment is by far the most common. Now, as for different syntactic roles themselves, unlike semantic role, which is limited in what part of speech phrases it applies to, and pragmatic role, which exists basically outside the parts of speech, syntactic role is based mostly on parts of speech and different combinations of them. There are some major ones, though. Nouns tend to be divided into the subject role, which in accusative alignment usually tries to combine the aspects of the agent and topic. Generally, if the sentence has an agent and patient, then the subject will fill in as the agent. But if it only has one noun phrase or no agent noun phrase, then the subject will take whatever it can get. Compare she broke the cup and the cup broke. In both situations, the cup undergoes the action of breaking and is thus generally considered a patient. But in the latter, there is no agent to fill the subject role, so it becomes the subject also. Most languages require a subject, even putting dummy subjects where there are no proper noun phrases, like in English, it's raining. However, some languages may be more lax with this and allow you to just say raining, like in Spanish. Then there's the object role, which attempts to perform the non-topic patient role, and usually gets away with being marked solely with word order, although some languages may have it as an adposition, making it effectively the same as the next role, the oblique role, or adpositional phrase. These, along with adverbials, fill every other semantic role other than agent and patient. Although, as just mentioned, sometimes right before a language develops grammatical case, the patient role, or in some alignments the agent role, becomes an oblique. As for non-noun roles, most tend to just directly correspond to different parts of speech, like the adverbial role described above, and the verb role. However, there is one other important concept, the subject-predicate distinction, which is kind of like the topic-comment distinction applied to syntactic role, in that the predicate is usually described as everything other than the subject. Now, there's one issue that consistently comes up in strict word order languages. What if you have an agent and a patient, but the patient is supposed to be the topic? Or what if you have a topic that's an oblique or isn't even a noun phrase? Well, there are two main ways these problems are solved. One I've already shown a bit. There's grammatical voice and topicalizing phrases. For grammatical voice, there's one in particular that's by far the most common, the passive voice. This allows you to convert the patient role, usually restricted to the object of a sentence, into the subject, allowing it to pragmatically be the topic. This in turn causes the agent, if you still wish to have it, to be delegated to the object, or more often, to an oblique. There are multiple ways cross-linguistically that this is usually done. There is the use of an ergative adposition on what was originally the subject, converting it into an oblique. There is the transformation of the verb into a stative through copula or morphology. And there's the converting of the verb into a non-finite form, usually the past participle. This usually also requires the previous process to also have taken place. English and many other languages do all three, but here's what it looks like if you don't. As for the other process, there's topicalizing phrases, which are usually an oblique or adverbial phrase put at the beginning of the sentence, just directly stating that the argument is the topic. In English, this looks like saying as for blank or in regards to blank. This process usually promotes a noun phrase, i.e. as for the cup, she broke it, but tends to be much more flexible, being able to promote obliques, i.e. turning she pet the soft dog on the couch into as for the couch, she pet the soft dog on it, verb phrases, as for the petting, it was done to the soft dog on the couch by her, and even adjectives and other attributives, as for the soft thing, it was the dog on the couch which she pet. As you can see though, syntax gets weirder and weirder the more things you topicalize. You may have also noticed that in English, the topicalized argument will often be replaced with a corresponding pronoun. Some languages use topicalizing phrases more than others, perhaps even removing the replacement pronoun or even the topicalizing marking. These languages are typically called topic-prominent languages, and are common across East Asia and the likes of Mandarin and Korean. This would be like saying the dog she pet. Now let's get into some actual basic syntax. First, there is one system that's very important to know. Head directionality. Within a phrase that has at least two arguments, there is usually one head and one dependent. A head is the part of the phrase that defines what it is, and is integral to its meaning, while a dependent is something more optional and specifies something about the head. Languages tend to vary between primarily head initial or primarily head final, with there actually being a pretty near 50-50 chance for languages to be either type. So as I go through each of these phrases, I will go over which part is more head-like and which is more dependent-like, and show the relation between the situation I'm describing and the situation of verb-object order, which is one of the most solidly head-directional systems, with the verb being the head and the object being the dependent. So let's begin with the most broad strokes word order, the order of subject, object, and verb. By far, the two most common word orders are SOV for head-final languages and SVO for head-initial. This is because, as mentioned, the order of object and verb is strongly based on head directionality. And, as mentioned, the subject is often related to the topic, which very heavily trends towards going first. So most languages just have the subject first, and determine the rest by head directionality. However, the interesting parts come when you look at non-subject initial word orders. The object initial word orders are the rarest, and I won't talk about them much because they tend to relate more to morphosyntactic alignment. With it being a common opinion that many of these languages are mislabeled as object initial, when really they just have patient-based subject, or patient initial syntax. However, when it comes to verb initial languages, they're actually increasingly head initial. As it ends up, the farther the subject is pushed back and the verb moved forward, the greater the head initial tendency. And this is because the subject actually has a little bit of dependentness to it. It's just that it is often masked by the topic initial rule. However, if a head initial language begins to value head initiality over topic initiality and subject-predicate separation, it may begin to push the subject back, as happened in varying degrees in some of the Celtic and Otto-Manguean languages. Next, we have the order of verb, object, and oblique. Both objects and obliques are obviously very dependent-like. However, it seems like obliques tend to like being final and dislike occurring between the object and verb. Head initial languages seem to almost always be VOX, because it satisfies the oblique dependent-like, and the final preference tendencies. However, in head final languages, things get a bit more complicated, with some languages fully committing to the dependent aspect with XOV word order, some fully to the final preferent aspect with OVX order, and less often, but still prevalently, some trying to compromise with the OXV order. Next, we've got another of the strongest head directionality-based situations, adpositions and adpositional phrases. Adpositions tend to come from verbs, and thus display a similar head preference to them. Prepositions almost always come in otherwise head initial languages, and postpositions in otherwise head final ones, although there is a slight general tendency towards postpositions. Next, we have determiners and their noun phrases. WALS lists demonstratives and numerals, but you can likely easily extrapolate article and quantifier syntax from their evolution related to demonstratives and numerals. See my parts of speech video for that. Generally, it seems like demonstratives are very consistently dependent-like, i.e. coming after the noun in head initial languages and before in head final, and don't have much of a tendency outside of that, although they tend to be more variable than others because they are more susceptible to random syntactic shift, which I'll get into in a bit. Meanwhile, numerals appear to be almost unrelated to head directionality, with a slight tendency towards appearing after the noun, but mostly being 50-50. If you remember, I mentioned in my parts of speech video that the definite article typically comes from the distal demonstrative, and the indefinite article comes from the singular numeral. The fact that these have such different syntax has actually led to some languages supposedly having different syntax or morphology for each article, like in Albanian, some dialects of Arabic, or Romanian. I'd also like to mention a very important but unexpected relation, that of auxiliary and verb. WALS does not have a record for this, but this is likely because it near always relates to the verb-object situation. However, while I often describe auxiliaries as the determiners of verbs, they have near opposite behavior, with auxiliaries being extremely head-like. This is likely due to how auxiliary phrases fundamentally work. Usually when there's an auxiliary, the corresponding verb is treated like a direct object of the auxiliary, which doesn't have to conflict with the main verb having a direct object itself. And if the language has a non-finite verb form, then it might be put into one of those. A good example being English I am walking, the dog, where am is the head of the whole verb phrase, and walk is put into the present participle or gerund form. But also, walking makes up its own verb phrase, and which takes the dog as its object. Now there's the relationship between adjective and noun phrase. Despite seeming more dependent-like, adjectives generally care more about being word final. You might want to factor in whether your adjectives evolved from verbs or nouns when you think about their syntax. They do have a non-negligible dependent-like tendency, though, and a lot of random variability, likely due to their multiple means of evolving. Relatedly, there are also genitives, which are adpositional phrases used as adjectives, such as the cost of war or the dog with a tie, and relative clauses, which are clauses used as adjectives, which I'll get more into in a bit. Both of these can often be treated syntactically and morphologically different from each other to varying degrees. Genitives, as opposed to the broadly final tendency of adjectives, seemingly have a strong dependent-like tendency with a slight general initial tendency. Meanwhile, relative clauses, while more complicated, seem to have a strong dependent-like and final tendency. Now, head directionality, as mentioned, is not a specific trait of a language, but a pattern, one that very often has exceptions. These can come about in a lot of ways. A language might have had its grammar heavily influenced by another, while other grammatical shifts were happening, which is what happened to English and why it doesn't much fit head directionality. Or a language might have recently shifted head direction by passing through a free word order phase, which happened during the transition of Proto-Indo-European to Latin to the Romance languages. Or a language might go through a specific, random, isolated syntax shift that leads to a weird exception. I mentioned this with demonstratives, where this is common. One way this can look is with a language starting out handling something one way, but then it doubles the word, or partners it with another word of a different syntax, so that it appears on both sides of the phrase it modifies. Then it drops the original word, so the meaning is transferred syntactically and or just straight up to another word. This happens by far the most commonly with the negative particle in the verb phrase, like in French and many, many other languages. But it can happen with determiners or other stuff too. Now, let's get into some clauses. A clause is basically a bit of language with a subject and a predicate, although one may be more implied. There are two types, independent clauses and dependent or subordinate clauses. Most of what I've said so far relates to independent clauses. A complete sentence generally needs to have at least one. An independent clause is a sentence in and of itself, with a complete self-contained meaning, while a subordinate clause is a clause used as one of your parts of speech to complete an independent clause's meaning. There are three core types of subordinate clause. Content clauses, which act as nouns, adverbial clauses, which, surprise, surprise, act as adverbs, although can provide some pretty unique meaning that may make them seem like more than adverbs, and relative clauses, which act as adjectives. Content clauses may be marked by a subordinating adverb, which is usually that or one of the interrogative words I go over in my parts of speech vid, sometimes with the addition of a suffix like the English ever, like in whoever he hit hopes that he vanishes. I know who did it, they think that is why they did it, or I want whichever one is best. Alternatively, some verbs may use deranking instead, which is when the parts of a subordinate clause are put into alternate forms, such as the subject being put in an accusative case, or the verb into a non-finite form like in an infinitive, such as with I want him to vanish, as opposed to I hope that he vanishes. Adverbial clauses, however, might have a subordinating adverb like other subordinate clauses, like in I will get to it when I get to it, or alternatively may have a subordinating conjunction, such as because, if, while, or many, many more. I recommend checking out the Wikipedia article, because a lot of seemingly unique phrases are actually adverbial, like in the phrases I would study if I needed to, or I won't because I don't want to. These phrases do modify the verb or phrase and thus are adverbial. It is also noteworthy that these subordinating adverbs and conjunctions are also influenced by head directionality in terms of where they appear, with the subordinating adverb being head-like and strongly initial trending. Now there's relative clauses, which seem like they'd be as simple as other clauses before them, but are perhaps one of the most variably complex syntactic systems in language. One strategy is just to slap on a subordinating adverb like other subordinate clauses and call it a day. And while this is a very common strategy, it is far from the only one, and even this has its complexities. Let's take the example of the sentence, the person I saw yesterday went home. This could be thought of as a combination of two phrases, I saw the person yesterday, and the person went home, with the former being delegated to the more relative or dependent than the latter. Otherwise, it would be something like, I saw the person who went home yesterday, and the person being the shared noun phrase. Here you see the strategy of gapping, where the relative clause is put in the relative position, as determined by head directionality, which I mentioned earlier, and the shared noun phrase is simply removed, or gapped, from the relative clause. In English, you may also add a subordinating adverb or pronoun, like in the person that/who I saw yesterday went home. There are three big things a language has to think about when making a relative meaning. 1, how the shared noun phrase is indicated in the clause. 2, how the clauses are joined together. And 3, where the relative clause is placed in the phrase. For number 1, strategies include the aforementioned gapping, the person I saw yesterday, pacifization, the person seen by me yesterday, which is usually just a stricter form of gapping where only the subject is allowed to be gapped, and passive voice must be used when the object needs to be instead. There is a resumptive pronoun, the person I saw him yesterday, which is found in some dialects of Arabic, and may be fronted, the person, him I saw yesterday, like in Greek. For number 2, there's the aforementioned subordinating adverb or pronoun, or the possibility of no linking word, or the relative might be treated like a genitive. The person of my seeing yesterday went home, like in Turkish, which also puts the verb in a non-finite form. For number 3, there's the simple relative either goes immediately before or after the shared noun phrase, which is most common, but Navajo instead has the whole relative phrase take the position of the noun phrase, called an internally headed or non-reduced relative clause. I saw the person yesterday went home. In some languages, such as Hindi or Walpuri, have the relative phrase be entirely disconnected, or somewhat like an adverbial phrase. Which person I saw yesterday, that person went home. Or, I saw the person yesterday, that person went home, which is known as an adjoined or correlative relative clause, or sometimes just described as a lack of relative clauses. This may or may not have some syntactic shifting in a subordinating adverb. And that should be all for this video. Sorry it's a bit late. Thank you for watching.